Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to be looking at the characteristics of life and then how we use those characteristics to classify life. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the characteristics of life. So there are 6 characteristics of life. The first is that all living things are organized. And we'll talk more about each of these in a little bit. All living things grow and develop. They reproduce. They respond to stimuli. They maintain stable internal conditions, which is called homeostasis. And they use energy. So anything that has all 6 of those characteristics of life is called an organism. So organisms are things that have all characteristics of life. So anything that is living is considered to be an organism. Okay, so let's talk about this organization business a little bit. So organisms are going to be organized into different parts. And the first part we're going to talk about is the cell. The cell is the smallest unit of life. So the cell is organized in different ways to make the body or make the organism work and function correctly. So we split the organisms into 2 groups based on these cells. The first are the unicellular organisms. So unicellular organisms are made of only one cell. They contain structures that are specialized to perform functions like movement, taking in nutrients, and controlling cell activities. So all of those things are done by specific parts of that cell. The second group are the multicellular organisms, and multicellular organisms are things that are made of more than one cell. And you can see that right here in this picture. We've got lots of different cells in this one organism. So the cells, they still have parts that perform certain functions, but they're grouped into collections of cells that have specialized functions. So like the red blood cells all have the same function, which is to carry oxygen. The skin cells all have the same function, which is to help protect the body. The muscle cells all have the same function. So multicellular organisms have more than one cell, and those cells work together to do a job. The next characteristic is growth and development. So unicellular organisms are going to grow as the cell increases in size. So the cell itself just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's different from a multicellular organism because a multicellular organism is going to grow as the number of cells increase. So it's going to keep adding more and more and more and more cells to make the organism itself bigger. So that's a huge difference between the two. So unicellular organisms, that cell itself just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You can kind of think of it like a balloon. So like when you blow air into a balloon, the balloon gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Multicellular organisms would be like if you took a whole bunch of balloons and tied them together. So instead of just having one balloon, you'd have a bunch of balloons, and to make that bunch get bigger, you'd just keep adding more and more and more balloons. So that covers the growth part. But as things grow, they change. And so we call that development. So development are the changes that occur in an organism during its lifetime. So that would be like over here in this picture. You can see all of the cells started the same in this stem cell, and then they developed into these different cells. So they went through a process called differentiation. And that happens in multicellular organisms. So they have cells that are going to specialize into specific different cell types during this development. So again, they go through differentiation to become like red blood cells and liver cells and bone cells and muscle cells and connective tissue cells and all the other kinds of cells that there are. So that happens in multicellular organisms. The next characteristic is reproduction. So reproduction is just the process by which one organism makes one or more new organisms. And we're going to be talking about that more when we get to chapter 3, I think it is, when we talk about mitosis and meiosis. But you can see here in this picture, we've got a parent cell, it's undergoing cell division, and then you have 2 new daughter cells. So they reproduced. You had 1 cell, it made 2 cells. The next one is, the next characteristic is respond to stimuli. So stimuli can be internal or external. So a stimuli is just something that causes a reaction. So it's something that causes a response, really. So like when this plant gets touched, you can see it collapses and it shrinks up. So that's how it responds. So that would be an external stimuli. Internal stimuli would be like when you are hungry, your stomach growls. That's an internal response. So you're responding to being hungry. So that would be internal. The next characteristic would be homeostasis. So homeostasis is just an organism's ability to maintain these steady internal conditions when the outside conditions change. So it's like keeping the body the same inside. So for example, your body maintains your body temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's part of your homeostasis. If your temperature gets higher than that, you don't feel good, right? And that's because you're out of whack. So you aren't in homeostasis anymore because you're not in that steady internal condition. And the reason that homeostasis is so important is because it's really, the cells need that specific steady, constant condition to function the best that they can. And we want our cells to function the best that they can, right? Because that's what keeps us alive. And then finally, the last characteristic is energy. Energy is required by all living things to perform every function. So everything you do, from breathing to moving to speaking to digesting your food, all of those things require energy. Plants need energy to live, to grow, to, respond to the touch like this one is, to produce seeds, everything. So energy is super important for all living things. Now, the sun is the main source of energy for living things. We can get it directly or indirectly. So if it's something that's getting that energy directly, it's going to be using the sun to produce that energy. And so that would be like flowers or plants. They go through photosynthesis. They use photosynthesis to to change the sun's energy into usable energy. We and other animals get ours indirectly. So that means we eat the flowers, or we eat the thing that eats the flowers, or we eat the thing that eats the thing that eats the flowers. So we're still getting our energy from the sun, but just not directly from the sun. We have to get it by eating something which eventually ate some sort of plant that got its energy directly from the sun. So that's what indirectly means. So those are the 6 characteristics of life. And that is where we're going to stop this section. All right, so now we're going to talk about classification. So classification is when we take things and put them in groups based on similar characteristics. So like if I was to look around the classroom, I could put people in groups based on the color shirt they're wearing. So like all the blue shirts would be in one group and all the red shirts would be in one group or whatever. We classify things all the time, and science is no different. We're going to classify a lot of things in science too. So this whole section is going to talk about how we classify things. Now, the current system of classification is called systematics. So that's what we use in science, this method of classification called systematics. And it uses all of the evidence that's known about an organism to classify it. And there's all kinds of things that we know about an organism. So all of this information is then used to classify the organism. So scientists look at the cell type. So do they have a nucleus or do they not have a nucleus? They look at habitat. So where do we find this organism living? They look at the way it gets its food and its energy. So, is it photosynthetic? Does it have to eat? Does it absorb its food? How does it get its energy? Structure and function of its features. So what it looks like and then how those parts work. And then its common ancestry. So what is it related to when we look at its evolutionary history? And then finally, molecular analysis. So scientists can take DNA samples and then look at the DNA and compare it and see how similar things are and group things based on that. There are some levels of classification. You can see up here there's a link, a YouTube link. You can look at that on your own if you would like to. We might watch it in class too. So the first level of classification is domain. After domain comes kingdom, then phylum, then class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, so what does that mean? So what that means is that domains are made of kingdoms. So domains are the biggest groups. This is the biggest level of classification. So domains are made of kingdoms. Kingdoms are made of phylums. Phylums are made of classes. Classes are made of orders. Orders are made of families. Families are made of genuses. And then the species make up the genuses. When I was growing up, the way we were told to remember that was by saying, "Dumb King Philip came over from Great Spain." The video that is up here, this YouTube video, what they say is, "Dumb King Philip coughed on Fred and got sick." So whatever you can come up with to help you remember those levels of classification is perfect. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So we're going to talk about the domains and the kingdoms. So the largest groups, the most general groups, are those domains. And there's 3 of those domains. Domains, again, get divided into kingdoms. So the first domain is domain archaea. These are simple unicellular organisms often found living in real extreme environments. So like volcano vents or ocean vents or places where where other things can't survive. Geysers, things like that. And over here you see a picture of some archaea. The second domain is domain bacteria. Domain bacteria makes up those is made up of those real simple unicellular organisms. And we'll talk more about bacteria a little bit more later this year. So these are things that can make you sick, or sometimes they're helpful for you. The third domain is the largest domain, and that is domain Eukarya. Eukarya contains 4 kingdoms. The first kingdom is kingdom Protista. So these are unicellular organisms, so they're made of one cell, but they're more complex than the bacteria or the archaea. So up here would be some examples of some things that would be found in kingdom Protista. So they're protozoans, so things like amoeba and euglena and volvox and things like those. Algae are protists, and then some really cool things called slime molds. And if you have time, you should actually Google slime molds and watch some YouTube videos of slime molds because they are super cool. The next group are kingdom fungi. And fungus can be multicellular or unicellular, so it can be made of one cell or it can be made of more than one cell. These are organisms that absorb their food, so that's how they get their energy, by absorbing their food. Examples of things in kingdom fungi would be things like molds and mushrooms. And so over here you can see some pictures of some molds and mushrooms and other kinds of fungus. So we've got some little puff balls here. This one's called a fly agaric, destroying angel. So some really cool fungus. The next group is kingdom plantae. So plantae are multicellular, so made of more than one cell, and these are things that make their own food, and they do that, remember, through that process called photosynthesis. We'll be talking about photosynthesis more as we move on through the year. So here are some examples of things in kingdom plantae. And then finally, the last kingdom is kingdom Animalia. And kingdom Animalia are multicellular organisms, and they take in their food, so they have to eat something. And there's a whole bunch of different examples down here on the bottom of different kinds of animals. So that's the kingdoms and domains. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about naming things next, because scientists give everything specific names. And we call that system of scientific naming binomial nomenclature. I know that's a tricky one. Binomial nomenclature. Remember, bi means two, so binomial, we're talking about a 2-word scientific name. So this is the system of scientific naming. Each organism has a 2-word scientific name, which is also that organism's species. So for example, Ursus arctos is the brown bear. Here is the elephant, which is Elephas maximus. Here is a type of mushroom called a shaggy mane. It's Coprinus comatus. A person, Homo sapien. Now, the first part of the name is the genus name. And what we do is we capitalize that first letter of the first name and then underline or italicize the whole word. So you could practice that here with this. So you would capitalize the E and then you would underline Elephas. Capitalize the C, underline Coprinus. Capitalize the H, underline Homo. The second part of the name might describe the appearance or the behavior of the organism or something like that. But the first letter this time is lowercase, and then the whole word is underlined or italicized again. So to make this correct, we would just underline Maximus, underline Comatus, underline Sapien. And we'll talk about examples of exactly how to write those things better in class. So we also have some classification tools that we use to help us to identify organisms. And the first one we're going to talk about is called a dichotomous key. So a dichotomous key is a series of descriptions that are arranged in pairs. That's an important part, that arranged in pairs part. And they're going to help you identify an unknown organism. So I'm going to pull up an example here of a dichotomous key. So you can see here that you've got these series of descriptions, right? And they're organized in pairs. So we got 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 3A, 3B, and so on. So let's try to key out this little guy right here using this dichotomous key. So what we would do is we would go, okay, so this mammal flies, its hand forms a wing. Is that true? Nope. So this mammal does not fly, its hand does not form a wing. That would be the one we would say is true. So we would go to step 2. All right, this mammal has no hair on its tail, or this mammal has hair on its tail. Well, if we look at the tail, it's definitely got some hair on its tail, right? So it tells us now to go to step 4. So we go down here to step 4. This mammal has a black mask across its face. This mammal does not have a black mask across its face. Go to step 6. I do not see a black mask, so we're going to go to step 6. This mammal is brown and has a white underbelly. Go to step 7. Or this mammal is not brown and does not have a white underbelly. Go to step 8. Well, it's brown, but there is no white underbelly, and I'm just going to tell you that. So we're going to go to step 8. So here we are. So this mammal is black and has a narrow white stripe on its forehead and broad white stripes on its back. Well, that's not true, right? So 8B, this mammal is not black and does not have white stripes. Well, it's not black, it does not have white stripes, so we're going to go to step 9. Step 9, this mammal has long ears and a short cottony tail. I would say it does not have long ears or a short tail. So this mammal has short ears and a medium length tail. Looks like short ears to me and a medium length tail. So that animal would be a woodchuck. You can key out number 8 yourself if you'd like to try that. We'll probably practice that one in class too. Okay, the second type of classification tool that we talk about is a cladogram. And a cladogram is a branched diagram that's going to show the relationships among organisms, including their common ancestors. So there's a series of branches, and each branch follows a new characteristic. So these all would have a common ancestor, all of these things along this line. But we have this characteristic here, so we have jaws that formed at some point during their evolutionary history. Well, hagfish don't have jaws, so they would have had to have branched off away from this common ancestry before jaws developed, right? So then we get up here and we've got lungs. Well, the perch doesn't have lungs, right? So it would have had to have branched off before lungs were formed. So they shared a common ancestor up to this point, but then the perch went this way and everything else went this way. Well, then we get claws or nails, right? Well, a salamander doesn't have claws or nails, so it had to have branched off from that common ancestor before claws or nails developed. Then we have lizard and pigeon, and then we developed some fur, and then we have the mouse and the chimp. So this is just telling us, okay, so they're more closely related. The mouse and the chimp are more closely related than, say, the chimp and the salamander, because they shared a common ancestor more recently than did the chimp and the lizard or the salamander. And we'll work a little bit more with cladograms in class. We've got a whole activity that we'll be doing as we move on. And that's everything for this section.